I have a story for you. My name is Marilyn McPhie, and I've been with the Storytellers of San Diego for a long time. I love Scottish stories. Do I play the guitar? No, I don't. Do I play the harp? No, I don't. Do I have friends that I can strong arm into playing music with me? Yeah, actually I do. So here's Rachel, who's going to play with me for this story. This is a story that happens at crossroads. Lots of things happen at crossroads, right? They're places where people meet. They're places where people say goodbye. They're places where people are married, places where people are buried. All sorts of places. They're vampires. But this is not a vampire story. No, this is a story, at least at the beginning, about dancing. Wonderful. See, you don't have to get yourself a violin, and you don't have to spend all those hours practicing. You just have to make friends. Anyway, this particular story about crossroads is a story about small towns in Scotland. Small towns where just outside the town there is often a crossroads. And those intersecting roads, they divide the land into 4 wedge-shaped pieces. And in many of those places, one of those pieces is designated as a dancing place. People come there to dance, and after years and years and years of dancing, the earth is hard and smooth, just perfect for dancing. And sometimes there's no music there, except for people's voices. You sing, of course, right? And the people know all the words. If you somehow just don't know one of the words, one of the verses, well, then you can drop out for a bit and join again when they come to the chorus. Or if you get a little bit winded from some of those dances, you can stop and wait till you've got your breath back. But sometimes they're lucky to have a piper, and sometimes if they're really, really lucky, they've got a fiddler, just like we have tonight. So this particular night where our story starts, people are gathered at the dancing place. Now everybody comes after work or after supper. They come along in ones and twos. Sometimes there'll be a whole family with the children joining hands and skipping along. Sometimes there'll be a mother with a bairn in her arms after she's gotten it back from the ferries. Sometimes there'll be a young lad on a wee pony. Sometimes a man with a horse and a cart. They come, as I said, in ones and twos and groups, but however they come, and they start dancing. And the people are so eager to get there that the crowd gathers early. But this particular night, everyone was dancing, but somebody came late. It was a young woman. She was dressed in a long black dress with a red tartan shawl, and she came into the dancing place, but she did not join in the dancing. She sat down beside a hedge, and she lowered her head, and she began to weep. And if you had asked about her, people would have said, "Oh, the poor thing. Last summer she fell in love, and she was to be married, but her fiancé, he went off to fight, and he did not return. They say he was killed and buried in a far-off place. But she is inconsolable." Well, that was an understatement. She simply wept all the time. All day, every day, and all night, every night. She wept and slept and wept and slept, and in the morning her pillow was always damp, though she had no memory of weeping in the night. So she was there. But there was one other latecomer. It was a man on a fine horse, a tall man with dark hair, very handsome. He came clattering into the dancing place. He slipped off that horse, and he asked the first woman he saw to dance. He was a great dancer and a very handsome man, and he danced and danced and danced and danced until by the end of the dancing time, he had danced with every woman there. from the youngest, gigglingest girl to the oldest granny. And then, the dancing done, the people needed to go home. So they began to leave by ones and twos and in families. And sometimes the children who had skipped delightedly into the dancing place, they were held sleeping by their parents as they went home. And sometimes people who had come by themselves left with a companion. That was the way of the dancing place. And finally, it was just, almost everyone was gone, but the weeping lass was there, and the tall stranger, and the fiddler, who was getting ready to leave. But the stranger, he went over to the young woman and he said, "Dance with me." "No, sir, I cannot." "Oh, but you can, and you will." And he reached down and took her hand and pulled her up. And as he did, she looked up into his face and she gasped, because it was the face of her love. "Oh," she said, "you have come back for me, but they told me that you were dead and buried in a far town." "Did they?" he said. "But I am here now, and we must dance." And he put his strong arm around her waist, and the fiddler could see that she was not quite done with the fiddling, and so she began to play again. And the couple danced and danced and danced and danced through the jigs and the reels and the strathspeys, and faster and faster and faster they danced. And the young woman didn't know if she could keep up or if she would simply fall to the ground, but finally the man dropped his hands and he said, "I must go." She said, Oh no, you just barely got here. I have missed you so much, don't leave." He said, "But I must return before dawn." You can't stay?" "I cannot stay." "Well then, take me with you." "Oh," he said, "you would not like where I live. It is small, it is crowded, it is narrow, it is dark, and it is damp. There's scarcely room enough for one, and not room for two." "Oh," she said, "but if we were together, we could improve it, or perhaps we could move to a better place. You must take me with you." And when he heard those words, he mounted his horse, and he reached for her hand and pulled her up behind him on the horse, and they took off down the path. And they went so fast, so fast, so fast, that the young woman was afraid that she would fall. Her shawl was streaming out behind her, and she put her arms around the man's waist, and as she did, she could feel that his shirt was damp, not just damp, but drenched, even though there had been no rain, and her own clothes were quite dry. So they were going very, very fast. That fast. She's good. So they were going so fast, and finally the young woman said, "Oh, where are we bound?" But answer came there none. "And how long must we ride?" But answer came there none. "And why is your shirt so wet?" But answer came there none. And finally the horse took them into a small village, and there was a kirk there. And the horse went right into the kirkyard and stopped beside a grave. And then the man slid off the horse and reached up to help the young woman down. And as he did, she looked down at his face, and once again she gasped. For now what she saw was not the face of her love, but a skeleton. And that skull had hollow eyes and a horrible grin. She said, "What has happened?" He said, "Those who told you that I was dead, they told you true. Dead and buried. And rest in peace is what they said, but I have had no peace. Your weeping and keening and wailing has disturbed my sleep night after night after night, and your tears have seeped down into my burial ground. I have no peace. You begged me to take you with me, and now I shall. You will join me here, and perhaps now I will be able to rest in peace." And so saying, that skeleton began to sink into the ground atop that grave. He still had her hand, and he began to pull her down, down, down with him. She cried, no, but he kept pulling and kept sinking. And finally, with a burst of as much as she could gather, she wrenched her hand free, and she began to run out of the kirkyard and down the path, out of that village. And she ran and ran and ran. She ran very fast. She didn't look behind her, though she could sense that skeleton was chasing after her, and he was coming closer and closer. At one point, he reached out his hand to grab her, but he only succeeded in grabbing the end of her shawl. And she put on another burst of speed. She gave it all she could. She ran and ran and ran and ran. And then finally, she saw the first rays of dawn coming up over the hill. And she heard a rooster crow, and she knew she was safe. It was only then that she sank to the ground in a faint. And that was where a young milkmaid found the weeping lass the next morning. She got some help, and they took her to a nearby farmhouse. When she finally came to, they asked her what she was doing there in the middle of the path. And she told them a wild story about a skeleton lover and how she barely escaped. It was a crazy story. They would never have believed it, except for the shawl. Because later that afternoon, an old man whose job it was to tidy up the kirkyard, he went back into the kirkyard, and as he was picking up the leaves, he saw a little triangle of red plaid atop one of the graves. And he bent down to pick it up, but it was stuck in the earth. He tried as hard as he could, but he couldn't pull it loose, and so he got some help, and even the strongest man, the strongest of his friends, could not pull it free. So they went home and they got shovels, and they began to dig and dig and dig, until finally they came to a coffin, and the end of that tartan shawl disappeared into the coffin. They got permission from the priest, and they pried open the lid of that coffin, and there they found a skeleton with the other end of that tartan shawl clutched in his bony fingers. They wrenched it free, and somebody remembered that young woman and the story that she told that no one could believe. So they folded up that shawl and they took it back to her, and she said yes, it was hers. She said, and I would fain have it back. And so they gave it to her, but the truth is, I don't think she ever wore that shawl again. She did not. But the very next Saturday, when it was time again to be at the dancing place, that weeping lass was there, no longer weeping. She did not just sit down and look to the ground, but she looked up, inviting someone to ask her to dance. And when someone did, she danced. She had a smile on her face. It seemed a little forced, a little stiff, but she danced several times that night. And after that, every single Saturday night, that lass was at the dancing place. She danced and danced and danced and danced, and gradually that smile became less stiff. And there began to be a look of some joy in her eyes. And before the summer was over, she had met a man, and they were married. And in time, they had a fine house and a fine family. And the lass was happy, or at least she appeared to be happy. The people who knew her, they said that no matter the trouble that came into her life, they never, ever, ever saw her shed a single tear. She had seen what that could lead to, and she had no desire to repeat the experience. The weeping lass at the dancing place. Thank you, and thank you so much, Rachel. Love having you here.